with the old breed, Disc 6.
During mid-afternoon, as we waited for the Army infantry, we sat numbly looking at nothing, with the bulkhead stare, the shock, horror, fear, and fatigue of 15 days of combat were wearing us down physically and emotionally. I could see it in the dirty, bearded faces of my remaining comrades. They had a hollowed-eyed, vacant look, peculiar to men under extreme stress for days and nights on end. Short but rough, 3 days, maybe 4, the Division CG had said before Peleliu. Now we had been at it 15 terrible days, with no end in sight. I felt myself choking up. I slowly turned my back to the men facing me as I sat on my helmet and put my face in my hands to try to shut out reality. I began sobbing. The harder I tried to stop, the worse it got. My body shuddered and shook. Tears flowed out of my scratchy eyes. I was sickened and revolted to see healthy young men get hurt and killed day after day. I felt I couldn't take any more. I was so terribly tired and so emotionally wrung out from being afraid for days on end that I seemed to have no reserve strength left. The dead were safe. Those who had gotten a $1 million wound were lucky. None of us left had any idea that we were just midway through what was to be a month-long ordeal for the 5th Marines and the 7th Marines. I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up at the tired, bloodshot eyes of Duke, our lieutenant. "What's the matter, Sledgehammer?" he asked in a sympathetic voice. After I told him how I felt, he said, "I know what you mean. I feel the same way. But take it easy. We've got to keep going. It'll be over soon, and we'll be back on Pavuvu." His understanding gave me the strength I needed, enough strength to endure 15 more terrible days and nights. When long files of soldiers, accompanied by Amtraks loaded with barbed wire and other supplies, came by, we received orders to move out. We were glad to see those Army men. As we shouldered our weapons and loads, a buddy said to me, "Sure wish we could dig in behind barbed wire at night. Makes a fella feel more secure." I agreed as we walked wearily toward the beach. After crossing back to northern Peleliu on 29 September, 3-5 bivouacked east of Umabrogel Mountain in the Ungartalolok area. We were familiar with this area from the first week of the campaign. It was fairly quiet and had been the bivouac area of the shattered 1st Marines for about a week after they came off the line and awaited ships to take them to Pavuvu. We were able to rest, but we were uneasy. As usual, we asked about the fate of friends and other units, more often than not with depressing results. Rumor had the 5th Marines slated to join the 7th Marines, already fighting on those dreaded coral ridges that had been the near destruction of the 1st Marines. The men tried not to think about it as they sat around in the muggy shade, brewed hot coffee in their canteen cups, and swapped souvenirs and small talk. From the north came the constant rattle of machine guns and the rumble of shells. Chapter 6. Brave Men Lost. "Okay, you people, stand by to draw rations and ammo. The battalion's going to reinforce the 7th Marines in the ridges." We received the unwelcome but inevitable news with fatalistic resignation as we squared away our weapons and gear. Our information had the casualty figure of the 7th Marines rapidly approaching that of the 1st Marines, and our own regimental strength wasn't much better than that of the 7th. All of Peleliu, except the central ridges, was now in our hands. The enemy held out in the Umabrogel pocket, an area about 400 yards by 1,200 yards in the ruggedest, worst part of the ridges. My memory of the remaining events of horror and death and violence amid the Peleliu ridges is as clear and distinct as a long nightmare, where specific events are recalled vividly the next day. I remember clearly the details of certain episodes that occurred before or after certain others, and can verify these with my notes and the historical references, but time and duration have absolutely no meaning in relation to those events from one date to the next. I was well aware of this sensation then. The terrain was so unbelievably rugged, jumbled, and confusing that I rarely knew where we were located. Only the officers had maps, so locations meant nothing in my mind. One ridge looked about like another, was about as rugged, and was defended as heavily as any other. We were usually told the name of this or that coral height or ridge when we attacked. To me, it meant only that we were attacking the same objective where other Marine battalions had been shot up previously. We were resigned to the dismal conclusion that our battalion wasn't going to leave the island until all the Japanese were killed, or we had all been hit. We merely existed from hour to hour, from day to day. Numbed by fear and fatigue, our minds thought only of personal survival. The only glimmer of hope was $1 million wound, or for the battle to end soon. As it dragged on and casualties mounted, a sense of despair pervaded us. It seemed that the only escape was to be killed or wounded. The will for self-preservation weakened. Many men I knew became intensely fatalistic. Somehow, though, one never could quite visualize his own death. It was always the next man. But getting wounded did seem inevitable. In a rifle company, it just seemed to be a matter of time. One couldn't hope to continue to escape the law of averages forever. On 3 October, our battalion made an attack on the Five Sisters, a rugged coral hill mass with 5 sheer walled peaks. Before the attack, the 11th Marines covered the area with artillery fire. We fired a heavy mortar barrage on the company front, and the machine guns laid down covering fire. As we ceased firing briefly, we watched the riflemen of 3-5 move forward onto the slopes before Japanese fire stopped them. We fired the mortars rapidly to give our men cover as they pulled back. The same fruitless attack was repeated the next day, with the same dismal results. K-35 lost 8 killed and 22 wounded at the Five Sisters. Each time we got orders to secure the guns after the riflemen stopped advancing, the mortar section stood by to go up as stretcher bearers. We always left a couple of men on each gun in case mortar fire was needed. We usually threw phosphorus and smoke grenades as a screen, and the riflemen covered us. But enemy snipers fired as rapidly as possible at stretcher bearers. The Japanese were merciless in this, as in everything else in combat. Because of the rugged, rock-strewn terrain and intense heat on Peleliu, 4 men were needed to carry 1 casualty on a stretcher. Everyone in the company took his turn as a stretcher bearer nearly every day. All hands agreed it was back-breaking, perilous work. My heart pounded from fear and fatigue each time we lifted a wounded man onto a stretcher, raised it, then stumbled and struggled across the rough ground, and up and down steep inclines, while enemy bullets snapped through the air and ricochets whined and pinged off the rocks. The snipers hit a stretcher bearer on more than one occasion, but luckily we always managed to drag everybody behind rocks until help came. Frequently, enemy mortars added their shells in an effort to stop us. Each time I panted and struggled with a stretcher under fire, I marveled at the attitude of the casualty. When conscious, the wounded Marine seemed at ease and supremely confident we would get him out alive. With bullets and shells coming in thick and fast, I sometimes doubted any of us could make it. Even discounting the effects of shock and the morphine administered by the corpsmen, The attitude of the wounded Marine seemed serene. When we reached a place out of the line of fire, the man usually would encourage us to put him down so we could rest. If he wasn't wounded severely, we stopped and all had a smoke. We would cheer him up by asking him to think of us when he got on board the hospital ship. Invariably, the not-so-seriously hurt were in high spirits and relieved. They were on their way out of hell, and they expressed pity for those of us left behind. With the more seriously wounded and the dying, we carried the stretcher as fast as possible to an Amtrak or ambulance jeep, which then rushed them to the battalion aid station. After getting them into a vehicle, we would throw ourselves down and pant for breath. When acting as a stretcher-bearer, struggling, running, crawling over terrain so rugged that sometimes the carriers on one end held the stretcher handles above their heads, while those on the other end held their handles almost on the rocks to keep the stretcher level, I was terrified that the helpless casualty might fall off onto the hard, sharp coral. I never saw this happen, but we all dreaded it. The apparent calmness of our wounded under fire stemmed in part from the confidence we shared in each other. None of us could bear the thought of leaving wounded behind. We never did, because the Japanese certainly would have tortured them to death. During the period between attacks by our battalion on the Five Sisters, our front line was formed on fairly level ground. The mortars were dug in some yards behind the line. The entire company was out in the open, and we knew the Japanese were watching us at all times from their lairs in the Five Sisters. We came under sniper and mortar fire only when the Japanese were sure of inflicting maximum casualties. Their fire discipline was superb. When they shot, someone usually got hit. When night came, it was like another world. Then the enemy came out of their caves, infiltrating or creeping up on our lines to raid all night, every night. Raids by individual enemy soldiers or small groups began as soon as darkness fell. Typically, one or more raiders slipped up close to Marine positions by moving during dark periods between mortar flares or star shells. They wore tabi, and their ability to creep in silently over rough rocks strewn with pulverized vegetation was incredible. They knew the terrain perfectly. Suddenly they rushed in jabbering or babbling incoherent sounds, sometimes throwing a grenade, but always swinging a saber, bayonet, or knife. Their skill and daring were amazing, matched only by the cool-headed, disciplined manner in which Marines met their attacks. Strict fire discipline on our part was required to avoid shooting friends if the enemy got into a position before he was shot. All we could do was listen in the dark to the desperate animalistic sounds and the thrashing around when a hand-to-hand fight occurred. No one was allowed out of his position after dark. Each Marine maintained a keen watch while his buddy tried to sleep. Mutual trust was essential. Frequently our men were killed or wounded in these nightly fights, but we invariably killed the foe. One night, so many Japanese crept around in front of the company and slipped in among the rocks and ground litter between some of the forward positions that much of the following morning was occupied with trying to kill them all. This was difficult, because in any direction one fired, one might hit a Marine. The excellent discipline and control exhibited by the Marines finally got all the Japanese without any Company K casualties. The only injury that occurred was to my friend Jay's dungaree trousers. Jay walked past my foxhole with a deliberate, stiff-kneed gait and wearing a wry expression on his face. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Ah, hell, I'll tell you later." He grinned sheepishly. "Go on, tell him, Jay," another man near him yelled teasingly. Several men laughed. Jay grinned and told them to shut up. He waddled on back to battalion like a tiny child who had soiled his pants, which was just what he had done. We all had severe cases of diarrhea by this time, and it had gotten the best of Jay. Considering what had happened, the incident really wasn't funny, but it was understandable. At daylight, Jay had slung his carbine over his shoulder and walked a short distance from his foxhole to relieve himself. As he stepped over a log, his foot came down squarely on the back of a Japanese lying in hiding. Jay reacted instantly, and so did the enemy soldier. Jay brought his carbine to bear on the Japanese's chest as the latter sprang to his feet. Jay pulled the trigger. Click. The firing pin was broken, and the carbine didn't fire. As the enemy soldier pulled the pin from a hand grenade, Jay threw the carbine at him. It was more an act of desperation than anything else. As Jay spun around and ran back toward us, yelling, "Shoot him!" the Japanese threw his grenade, striking my friend in the middle of the back. It fell to the deck and lay there, a dud. The Japanese then drew his bayonet. Waving it like a sword, he took off after Jay at a dead run. Jay had spotted a BAR man and fled in his direction, yelling for him to shoot the enemy. The BAR man stood up, but didn't fire. The Japanese came on. Jay was running and yelling as hard as he could. After agonizing moments, the BAR man took deliberate aim at the enemy soldier's belt buckle and fired most of a 20-round magazine into him. The soldier collapsed in a heap. The blast of automatic fire had cut his body nearly in two. Terrified and winded, Jay had had a close call. When he asked the BAR man why in the hell he had waited so long to fire, that character grinned. I heard him reply something to the effect that he thought he'd just let the Japanese get a little closer to see if he could cut him into two pieces with his BAR. Jay obviously didn't appreciate his close call being used as the subject of an experiment. As all the men laughed, Jay received permission to go back to battalion headquarters to draw a clean pair of trousers. The men kidded him a great deal about the episode, and he took it all with his usual good nature. During the entire period among the Umer-Brogel ridges, a nuisance Marine infantrymen had to contend with was the rear echelon Souvenir hunters. These characters came up to the rifle companies during lulls in the fighting and poked around for any Japanese equipment they could carry off. They were easy to spot because of the striking difference between their appearance and that of the infantry. During the latter phase of the campaign, the typical infantryman wore a worried, haggard expression on his filthy, unshaven face. His bloodshot eyes were hollow and vacant from too much horror and too little sleep. His camouflaged helmet cover, if it hadn't been torn off against the rocks, was gray with coral dust and had a tear or two in it. His cotton dungaree jacket, originally green, was discolored with coral dust, filthy, greasy with rifle oil, and as stiff as canvas from being soaked alternately with rain and sweat and then drying. His elbows might be out, and his knees frequently were, from much hitting the deck on the coral rock. His boondockers were coated with gray coral dust, and his heels were worn off completely by the sharp coral. The infantrymen's calloused hands were nearly blackened by weeks of accumulation of rifle oil, mosquito repellent, an oily liquid called scat, dirt, dust, and general filth. Overall, he was stooped and bent by general fatigue and excessive physical exertion. If approached closely enough for conversation, he smelled bad. The frontline infantry bitterly resented the Souvenir hunters. One major in the 7th Marines made it a practice of putting them into the line if they came into his area. His infantrymen saw to it that the visitors stayed put until released to return to their respective units in the rear areas. During a lull in our attacks on the Five Sisters, I was on an ammo-carrying detail and talking with a rifleman friend after handing him some bandoliers. It was quiet, and we were sitting on the sides of his shallow foxhole as his buddy was bringing up K-rations. By quiet, I mean we weren't being fired on, but there was always the sound of firing somewhere on the island. Two neat, clean, fresh-looking Souvenir hunters wearing green cloth fatigue caps instead of helmets and carrying no weapons walked past us, headed in the direction of the Five Sisters, several hundred yards away. When they got a few paces in front of us, one of them stopped and turned around just as I was on the verge of calling to them to be careful where they went. The man called back to us asking, "Hey, you guys, where's the front line?" "You just passed through it," I answered serenely. The second Souvenir hunter spun around. They looked at each other and then at us in astonishment. Then, grabbing the bills of their caps, they took off on the double, back past us toward the rear. They kicked up dust and never looked back. "Hell, Sledgehammer, you should have let 'em go on so they'd get a good scare," chided my friend. I told him we couldn't just let them walk up on a sniper. "Serve them rear echelon bastards right, and they call them guys Marines," he grumbled. In fairness, I must add that some of the rear area service troops volunteered and served as stretcher bearers. In our myopic view, we respected and admired only those who got shot at, and to hell with everyone else. This was unfair to non-combatants who performed essential tasks, but we were so brutalized by war that we were incapable of making fair evaluations. A leader dies. By 5 October, D+20, the 7th Marines had lost about as many men as the 1st Marines had lost earlier in the battle. The regiment was now finished as an assault force on the regimental level. The 5th Marines, the last of the 1st Marine Division's infantry regiments, began to relieve the 7th Marines that day. Some of the men of the battered regiment would be killed or wounded in subsequent actions in the draws and valleys among the ridges of Peleliu, but the 7th Marines were through as a fighting force for the campaign. On 7 October, 3-5 made an assault up a large draw called Horseshoe Valley, known commonly as the Horseshoe. There were numerous enemy heavy guns in caves and emplacements in the ridges bordering the Horseshoe to the west, north, and east. Our battalion was supposed to knock out as many of them as possible. We were supported by 6 Army tanks, because the 1st Marine Tank Battalion had been relieved on 1 October to be sent back to Pavuvu. Somebody erroneously assumed there would be no further need for tanks on Peleliu. My guess is that the 1st Tank Battalion was relieved not because the men were badly depleted and debilitated, the official reason given, but because the machines were. Machines wore out or needed overhauling and maintenance, but men were expected to keep going. Tanks, Amtraks, trucks, aircraft, and ships were considered valuable and difficult to replace way out in the Pacific. They were maintained carefully and not exposed needlessly to wear or destruction. Men, infantrymen in particular, were simply expected to keep going beyond the limits of human endurance until they got killed or wounded or dropped from exhaustion. Our attack on the Horseshoe was preceded by terrific artillery fire from our big guns. The shells swished and whined toward the ridges for 2.5 hours. The mortars added their bit, too. The attack was surprisingly successful. The Horseshoe wasn't secured, but many Japanese were killed. We also knocked out many caves containing heavy guns, but only after several of the tanks took hits from them. In the estimation of the Marines, the Army tankers did a good job. Here the tanks operated with our riflemen attached. It was a case of mutual support. The tanks pulled up to the caves and fired into them point blank with their 75mm cannon. Wham-bam! The machine guns never seemed to stop. A tank unattended by riflemen was doomed to certain destruction from enemy suicide crews carrying mines, and the riflemen got a lot of protection from the tanks. About the only instance I know of where tanks tried to operate without riflemen in the Pacific was a case of Army tanks on Okinawa. Predictably, the Japanese knocked out most of those tanks. Marine tanks always operated with riflemen, like a dog with his fleas. But with tanks and riflemen, it was mutually beneficial. After the attack of 7 October on the Horseshoe, 3-5 pulled back some distance from the ridges. Shortly thereafter, we again went up toward the northern part of the island. Between 8 and 11 October, we emplaced our 60mm mortars between the west road and the narrow beach. We were only a few yards from the water. Thus set up, we fired over the west road, our front line beyond, and onto the ridges. We had an observer somewhere across the road who sent us orders by the sound-powered phone. We kept up a brisk rate of fire because Japanese had infiltrated into positions on the ridge next to the road and were sniping at vehicles and troops with deadly effect. Our mortar fire helped pin them down and clean them out. We had good gun emplacements among some rocks and were screened by a narrow strip of thick foliage between us and the road, and therefore from the enemy in the ridge beyond. I was extremely confused as to where we had left our company. An NCO told me our mortars were detached temporarily from Company K and were supporting another unit hard-pressed by snipers. The enemy were firing from positions that were almost impossible to locate, and they shot any and everybody they could, even casualties being evacuated by Amtraks. More than one desperate Amtrak driver, as he raced down the west road toward the regimental aid station, arrived only to find his helpless cargo slaughtered where they lay. While we were in this position, we were particularly vulnerable to infiltrators who might slip in along the beach, as well as from the water to our rear. We kept watch in all directions at night. In this place, there were no friendly troops to our rear, just the water's edge about 10 feet away, and then the ocean-covered reef. The water was only about knee-deep for quite a distance out. The Japanese would wade out, slip along the reef, and come in behind us. One night, while I was firing flare shells, James T. Jim Burke, a Marine we called the Fatalist, was manning number 1 gun. Between firing missions, I could see him sitting on his helmet next to his gun, keeping watch to our left and rear. "Hey, Sledgehammer, let me see your carbine a minute," he whispered nonchalantly in his usual laconic manner. He had a .45 pistol, which was of little use at much distance. I handed him my carbine. I didn't know what he saw, so I followed his gaze as he pointed my carbine toward the sea. In the pale light, a shadowy figure was moving slowly and silently along the reef, parallel to the shoreline in the shallow water. The man couldn't have been more than 30 yards away, or we couldn't have seen him in the dim moonlight. There was no doubt that he was a Japanese, trying to get farther along to where he could slip ashore and creep up on our mortars. No challenge or demand for password was even considered in a situation like that. No Marine would be creeping along the reef at night. The Fatalist rested his elbows on his knees and took careful aim as the figure moved slowly through the glassy, smooth water. 2 quick shots. The figure disappeared. The Fatalist flipped the safety back on, handed me my carbine, and said, "Thanks, Sledgehammer." He appeared as unconcerned as ever. During the morning of 12 October, an NCO brought word that we were to take up our guns. The mortar section was to rejoin Company K. We gathered our gear and mortar. Snafu, George Sarrett, and I got into a jeep parked along a sheltered part of the road. We had to hang on because the driver took off with a lurch in a cloud of dust and drove like hell down the west road, bordered by the sniper-infested ridge. It was my first and only Jeep ride during my entire enlistment. It was an eventful day because of that. Shortly, the driver stopped and let us off in a supply area where we waited for an NCO who was to guide us up into the ridges. Directly, the rest of the Company K mortarmen arrived with directions to reach the company. We hoisted our mortar and other weapons and gear and headed across the road. We picked our way around the end of the ridge, then headed up a narrow valley filled with skeletons of shattered trees jutting up here and there on the slopes amid crazy angled coral masses. Johnny Marmot came striding down the incline of the valley to meet us as we started up. Even before I could see his face clearly, I knew from the way he was walking that something was dreadfully amiss. He lurched up to us, nervously clutching the web strap of the submachine gun slung over his shoulder. I had never seen Johnny nervous before, even under the thickest fire, which he seemed to regard as a nuisance that interfered with his carrying out his job. His tired face was contorted with emotion. His brow was knitted tightly, and his bloodshot eyes appeared moist. It was obvious he had something fearful to tell us. We shuffled to a halt. My first thought was that the Japanese had slipped in thousands of troops from the northern Palaus, and that we would never get off the island. No, maybe the enemy had bombed some American city or chased off the Navy as they had done at Guadalcanal. My imagination went wild, but none of us was prepared for what we were about to hear. "Howdy, Johnny," someone said as he came up to us. "All right, you guys, let's get squared away here," he said, looking in every direction but at us. This was strange because Johnny wasn't the least reluctant to make eye contact with death, destiny, or the general himself. Okay, you guys, he repeated, obviously flustered. A couple of men exchanged quizzical glances. "The skipper is dead. Ack has been killed," Johnny finally blurted out, then looked quickly away from us. I was stunned and sickened. Throwing my ammo bag down, I turned away from the others, sat on my helmet, and sobbed quietly. "Those goddamn slant-eyed sons of bitches," someone behind me groaned. Never in my wildest imagination had I contemplated Captain Haldane's death. We had a steady stream of killed and wounded leaving us, but somehow I assumed Ack was immortal. Our company commander represented stability and direction in a world of violence, death, and destruction. Now, his life had been snuffed out. We felt forlorn and lost. It was the worst grief I endured during the entire war. The intervening years have not lessened it any. Captain Andy Haldane wasn't an idol, he was human, but he commanded our individual destinies under the most trying conditions with the utmost compassion. We knew he could never be replaced. He was the finest Marine officer I ever knew. The loss of many close friends grieved me deeply on Peleliu and Okinawa, but to all of us, the loss of our company commander at Peleliu was like losing a parent we depended upon for security. Not our physical security, because we knew that was a commodity beyond our reach in combat, but our mental security. Some of the men threw their gear violently to the deck. Everybody was cursing and rubbing his eyes. Finally, Johnny pulled himself together and said, "Okay, you guys, let's move out." We picked up mortars and ammo bags, feeling as though our crazy world had fallen apart completely. We trudged slowly and silently in single file up the rubble-strewn valley to rejoin Company K. At the time of Captain Haldane's death, The bulk of Company K was operating with its parent battalion, 3-5, on Hill 140 within the Umerbrogel pocket. In an attempt to orient himself to the strange terrain his company was occupying, Haldane raised his head and looked over a ridge. A sniper's bullet killed him instantly. First Lieutenant Thomas J. "Stumpy" Stanley succeeded him as commander of K-35. Stanley led Company K through the remainder of the Peleliu campaign and on to Okinawa the following spring. So ended the outstanding combat career of a fine officer who had distinguished himself at Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. We had lost our leader and our friend. Our lives would never be the same, but we turned back to the ugly business at hand. The stench of battle. Johnny led us on up through a jumble of rocks on Hill 140. Company K's line was emplaced along a rock rim, and we set up the mortars in a shallow depression about 20 yards behind it. The riflemen and machine gunners in front of us were in among rocks along the rim of Hill 140, facing east toward Walt Ridge and the northern end of the infamous Horseshoe. We had previously attacked that valley from its southern end. From the rim of Hill 140, the rock contours dropped away in a sheer cliff to a canyon below. No one could raise his head above the rim rock without immediately drawing heavy rifle and machine gun fire. The fighting around the pocket was as deadly as ever, but of a different type from the early days of the campaign. The Japanese fired few artillery or mortar barrages, just a few rounds at a time when assured of inflicting maximum casualties. That they usually did, and then secured the guns to escape detection. Sometimes there was an eerie quiet. We knew they were everywhere in the caves and pillboxes, but there was no firing in our area, only the sound of firing elsewhere. The silence added an element of unreality to the valleys. If we moved past a certain point, the Japanese opened up suddenly with rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. It was like a sudden storm breaking. More often than not, we had to pull back, and not a man in the company had seen a live enemy anywhere. They couldn't hope to drive us off by then or to be reinforced themselves. From that point onward, they killed solely for the sake of killing, without hope and without higher purpose. We were fighting in Peleliu's ridges and valleys, in terrain the likes of which most Americans could not even visualize, against an enemy unlike anything most Americans could imagine. The sun bore down on us like a giant heat lamp. Once I saw a misplaced phosphorus grenade explode on the coral from the sun's intense heat. We always shaded our stacked mortar shells with a piece of ammo box to prevent this. Occasional rains that fell on the hot coral merely evaporated like steam off hot pavement. The air hung heavy and muggy. Everywhere we went on the ridges, the hot, humid air reeked with the stench of death. A strong wind was no relief. It simply brought the horrid odor from an adjacent area. Japanese corpses lay where they fell among the rocks and on the slopes. It was impossible to cover them. Usually there was no soil that could be spaded over them, just the hard, jagged coral. The enemy dead simply rotted where they had fallen. They lay all over the place in grotesque positions, with puffy faces and grinning buck-toothed expressions. It is difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced it the ghastly horror of having your sense of smell saturated constantly with the putrid odor of rotting human flesh day after day, night after night. This was something the men of an infantry battalion got a horrifying dose of during a long, protracted battle such as Peleliu. In the tropics, the dead became bloated and gave off a terrific stench within a few hours after death. Whenever possible, we removed marine dead to the rear of the company's position. There they were usually laid on stretchers and covered with ponchos, which stretched over the head of the corpse down to the ankles. I rarely saw a dead Marine left uncovered with his face exposed to sun, rain, and flies. Somehow it seemed indecent not to cover our dead. Often, though, the dead might lie on the stretchers for some time and decompose badly before the busy graves registration crews could take them for burial in the division cemetery near the airfield. During the fighting around the Ummerbrogel pocket, there was a constant movement of one wearied, depleted Marine company being relieved by another, slightly less weary, depleted company. We seemed to rotate from one particularly dangerous part of the line to one slightly less so, and back again, continuously. There were certain areas we moved into and out of several times as the campaign dragged along its weary, bloody course. In many such areas I became quite familiar with the sight of some particular enemy corpse, as if it were a landmark. It was gruesome to see the stages of decay proceed from just killed, to bloated, to maggot-infested rotting, to partially exposed bones. Like some biological clock marking the inexorable passage of time. On each occasion my company passed such a landmark, we were fewer in number. Each time we moved into a different position, I could determine the areas occupied by each rifle company as we went into that sector of the line. Behind each company position lay a pile of ammo and supplies, and the inevitable rows of dead under their ponchos. We could determine how bad that sector of the line was by the number of dead. To see them so always filled me with anger at the war and the realization of the senseless waste. It depressed me far more than my own fear. Added to the awful stench of the dead of both sides was the repulsive odor of human excrement everywhere. It was all but impossible to practice simple elemental field sanitation on most areas of Peleliu because of the rocky surface. Field sanitation during maneuvers and combat was the responsibility of each man. In short, under normal conditions, he covered his own waste with a scoop of soil. At night, when he didn't dare venture out of his foxhole, he simply used an empty grenade canister or ration can, threw it out of his hole, and scooped dirt over it the next day if he wasn't under heavy enemy fire. But on Peleliu, except along the beach areas and in the swamps, digging into the coral rock was nearly impossible. Consequently, thousands of men, most of them around the Ummerbrogel pocket and the ridges, many suffering with severe diarrhea, fighting for weeks on an island 2 miles by 6 miles, couldn't practice basic field sanitation. This fundamental neglect caused an already putrid tropical atmosphere to become inconceivably vile. Added to this was the odor of thousands of rotting, discarded Japanese and American rations. At every breath, one inhaled hot, humid air heavy with countless repulsive odors. I felt as though my lungs would never be cleansed of all those foul vapors. It may not have been that way down on the airfield and in other areas where the service troops were encamped, but around the infantry in the Ummerbrogel pocket, the stench varied only from foul to unbearable. In this garbage-filled environment, the flies, always numerous in the tropics anyway, underwent a population explosion. This species was not the unimposing common housefly, the presence of one of which in a restaurant is enough to cause most Americans today to declare the place unfit to serve food to the public. Peleliu's most common fly was the huge blowfly, or blue bottle fly. This creature has a plump, metallic, greenish-blue body, and its wings often make a humming sound during flight. The then new insecticide, DDT, was sprayed over the combat areas on Peleliu for the first time anywhere. It supposedly reduced the adult fly population while Marines were still fighting on the ridges, but I never noticed that the flies became fewer in number. With human corpses, human excrement, and rotting rations scattered across Peleliu's ridges, those nasty insects were so large, so glutted, and so lazy that some could scarcely fly. They could not be waved away or frightened off a can of rations or a chocolate bar. Frequently, they tumbled off the side of my canteen cup into my coffee. We actually had to shake the food to dislodge the flies, and even then they sometimes refused to move. I usually had to balance my can of stew on my knee, spooning it up with my right hand, while I picked the sluggish creatures off the stew with my left. They refused to move or to be intimidated. It was revolting, to say the least, to watch big fat blowflies leave a corpse and swarm into our sea rations. Even though none of us had much appetite, we still had to eat. A way to solve the fly problem was to eat after sunset or before sunrise when the insects were inactive. Chow had to be unheated then, because no sterno tablets or other form of light could be used after dark. It was sure to draw enemy sniper fire. Each morning just before sunrise, when things were fairly quiet, I could hear a steady humming sound, like bees in a hive, as the flies became active with the onset of daylight. They rose up off the corpses, refuse, rocks, brush, and wherever else they had settled for the night, like a swarm of bees. Their numbers were incredible. Large land crabs crawled all over the ridges at night, attracted by corpses. Their rustling through dry debris often was indistinguishable from prowling enemy soldiers. We responded by tossing a grenade at the sound. In addition to rotting corpses and organic waste, the litter of smashed and worn-out equipment of every type became more abundant as the battle dragged on, and the size of the Umurbrogel pocket shrank slowly. The ridges and ravines were littered with the flotsam of fierce combat. Debris of battle was everywhere, and became more noticeable as the weeks dragged on. I still see clearly the landscape around one particular position we occupied for several days. It was a scene of destruction and desolation that no fiction could invent. The area was along the southwestern border of the pocket, where ferocious fighting had gone on since the second day of battle, 16 September. The 1st Marines, the 7th Marines, and now the 5th Marines, all in their turn, had fought against this same section of ridges. Our exhausted battalion, 3-5, moved into the line to relieve another slightly more exhausted battalion. It was the same old weary shuffling of one tired, depleted outfit into the line to relieve another, whose sweating men trudged out of their positions, hollow-eyed, stooped, grimy, bearded zombies. The Company K riflemen and machine gunners climbed up the steep ridge and into the crevices and holes of the company we relieved. Orders were given that no one must look over the crest of the ridge, because enemy rifle and machine gun fire would kill instantly anyone who did. As usual, the troops pulling out gave our men the dope on the local conditions, what type of fire to expect, particular danger spots, and possible infiltration routes at night. My mortar went into a gun pit occupied by one of the 60mm mortars of the company we were relieving. The gun pit was among coral rocks about 20 yards from the foot of the ridge. An extremely youthful Marine was just buckling the leather strap around the bipod and tube of his 60mm mortar as I walked up near the position and put down my heavy ammo bag. I sat on my helmet and started talking to him as the rest of our squad moved into their positions. As the young man looked up, I was struck by the agonized expression on his face. He didn't seem happy, the way he should have, about being relieved. "You guys watch out for the Japs at night. 2 of the bastards got into this gun pit last night and cut up our gunner and assistant gunner," he said. He told me in a strained voice that the crew was so occupied firing the mortar during the previous night that 2 Japanese who slipped through the line on the ridge managed to creep up close to the pit without detection. They jumped in and cut up the 2 men working the mortar before nearby mortar ammo carriers killed them. The wounded Marines had been evacuated, but one of them had died, and the other was in poor condition. The bodies of the Japanese had been thrown into some nearby bushes. The man telling me of the tragedy and another crouching beside the gun pit had been ammo carriers, but had now assumed new duties as gunner and assistant. I noticed that as the new gunner folded and strapped his gun to leave, he seemed reluctant to touch the bottom or sides of the emplacement. When he left and we came closer to the gun pit to set up our mortar, I saw why. The white coral sides and bottom were spattered and smeared with the dark red blood of his 2 comrades. After we got our gun emplaced, I collected up some large scraps of cardboard from ration and ammo boxes and used them to cover the bottom of the pit as well as I could. Fat, lazy blowflies were reluctant to leave the blood-smeared rock. I had long since become used to the sight of blood, but the idea of sitting in that blood-stained gun pit was a bit too much for me. It seemed almost like leaving our dead unburied to sit on the blood of a fellow Marine spilled out on the coral. I noticed that my buddy looked approvingly at my efforts as he came back from getting orders for our gun. Although we never discussed the subject, he apparently felt as I did. As I looked at the stains on the coral, I recalled some of the eloquent phrases of politicians and newsmen about how gallant it is for a man to shed his blood for his country, and to give his life's blood as a sacrifice, and so on. The words seemed so ridiculous. Only the flies benefited. The wind blew hard. A drizzling rain fell out of a leaden sky that seemed to hang just above the ridge crest. Shattered trees and jagged rocks along the crest looked like stubble on a dirty chin. Most green trees and bushes had long since been shattered and pulverized by shell fire. Only the grotesque stumps and branches remained. A film of fine coral dust covered everything. It had been dust before the rain, but afterward it was a grimy coating of thin plaster. The overwhelming grayness of everything in sight caused sky, ridge, rocks, stumps, men, and equipment to blend into a grimy oneness. Weird, jagged contours of Peleliu's ridges and canyons gave the area an unearthly, alien appearance. The shattered vegetation and the dirty white splotches peppering the rocks where countless bullets and shell fragments had struck off the weathered gray surfaces contributed to the unreality of the harsh landscape. Rain added the final touch. On a battlefield, rain made the living more miserable and forlorn, and the dead more pathetic. To my left lay a couple of bloated Japanese corpses teeming with maggots and inactive flies who seemed to object to the rain as much as I did. Each dead man still wore the 2 leather cartridge boxes, one on either side of his belt buckle, neat wrap leggings, tabi shoes, helmets, and packs. Beside each corpse lay a shattered and rusting Arisaka rifle, smashed against a rock by some Marine to be certain it wasn't used again. Cans of C rations and K ration boxes, opened and unopened, lay around our gun pit, along with discarded grenade and mortar shell canisters. Scattered about the area were discarded U.S. helmets, packs, ponchos, dungaree jackets, web cartridge belts, leggings, boondockers, ammo boxes of every type, and crates. The discarded articles of clothing and the inevitable bottle of blood plasma bore mute testimony that a Marine had been hit there. Many tree stumps had a machine gun ammo belt draped over them. Some of these belts were partially filled with live cartridges. Amid all this evidence of violent combat, past and continuing, I was interested in the fact that spent, or partially so, machine gun ammo belts so often seemed to be draped across a shattered stump or bush rather than lying on the ground. In combat, I often experienced fascination over such trivia, particularly when exhausted physically and strained emotionally. Many combat veterans told me they were also affected the same way. All around us lay the destruction and waste of violent combat. Later, on the muddy clay fields and ridges of Okinawa, I would witness similar scenes on an even vaster scale. There, the battlefield would bear some resemblance to others described in World War II. During the muddy stalemate before Shuri, the area would resemble descriptions I had read of the ghastly, corpse-strewn morass of Flanders during World War I. These, though, were typical modern battlefields. They were nothing like the crazy contoured coral ridges and rubble-filled canyons of the Ummerbrogel Pocket on Peleliu. Particularly at night, by the light of flares or on a cloudy day, it was like no other battlefield described on Earth. It was an alien, unearthly, surrealistic nightmare, like the surface of another planet. I have already mentioned several times the exhaustion of the Marines as the campaign wore on. Our extreme fatigue was no secret to the Japanese either. As early as 6 October, 9 days before we were relieved, a captured document reported that we appeared worn out and were fighting less aggressively. The grinding stress of prolonged heavy combat, the loss of sleep because of nightly infiltration and raids, the vigorous physical demands forced on us by the rugged terrain, and the unrelenting, suffocating heat were enough to make us drop in our tracks. How we kept going and continued fighting, I'll never know. I was so indescribably weary, physically and emotionally, that I became fatalistic, praying only for my fate to be painless. The $1,000,000 wound seemed more of a blessing with every weary hour that dragged by. It seemed the only escape, other than death or maiming. In addition to the terror and hardships of combat, each day brought some new dimension of dread for me. I witnessed some new ghastly, macabre facet in the kaleidoscope of the unreal, as though designed by some fiendish ghoul to cause even the most hardened and calloused observer among us to recoil in horror and disbelief. Late one afternoon, a buddy and I returned to the gun pit in the fading light. We passed a shallow defilade we hadn't noticed previously. In it were 3 Marine dead. They were lying on stretchers where they had died before their comrades had been forced to withdraw some time earlier. I usually avoided confronting such pitiful remains. I never could bear the sight of American dead neglected on the battlefield. In contrast, the sight of Japanese corpses bothered me little, aside from the stench and the flies they nourished. As we moved past the defilade, my buddy groaned. Jesus! I took a quick glance into the depression and recoiled in revulsion and pity at what I saw. The bodies were badly decomposed and nearly blackened by exposure. This was to be expected of the dead in the tropics. But these Marines had been mutilated hideously by the enemy. One man had been decapitated. His head lay on his chest. His hands had been severed from his wrists and also lay on his chest near his chin. In disbelief, I stared at the face as I realized that the Japanese had cut off the dead Marine's penis and stuffed it into his mouth. The corpse next to him had been treated similarly. The third had been butchered, chopped up like a carcass, torn by some predatory animal. My emotions solidified into rage and a hatred for the Japanese beyond anything I ever had experienced. From that moment on, I never felt the least pity or compassion for them, no matter what the circumstances. My comrades would field strip their packs and pockets for souvenirs and take gold teeth, but I never saw a Marine commit the kind of barbaric mutilation the Japanese committed if they had access to our dead. When we got back to the gun pit, my buddy said, "Sledgehammer, did you see what the Nips did to them bodies? Did you see what them poor guys had in their mouths?" I nodded as he continued, "Christ, I hate them slant-eyed bastards." "Me too. They're mean as hell," was all I could say. Victory at high cost. 12 October continued to be an eventful day for us on Hill 140. Following Captain Haldane's death in the morning, we set up our mortars below and behind a 75mm pack howitzer, tied down within Company K's lines. We were to fire our usual support for the company, but we also were to provide covering fire for the artillery piece. Johnny Marmot was observing for us through a crack in the coral rock up near the howitzer when he suddenly called down to us that he saw some Japanese officers just outside the mouth of a cave. Apparently confident they were sheltered from American fire, they were just sitting down to eat at a table on a ledge beneath a thatched canopy. Johnny called the range to us and the order to fire 5 rounds. Snafu sighted in on the proper aiming stake, repeated Johnny's range, and yelled, "Fire 1." I grabbed a shell, repeated the range and charge, pulled off the proper number of powder increments from between the tail fins, put my right thumb over the safety pin, pulled the safety wire, and dropped the shell into the muzzle. Snafu realigned the sight after the recoil, grabbed the bipod feet, and yelled, "Fire 2." I prepared the second shell and dropped it into the tube. It went smoothly, and we got all the rounds off in short order. We listened tensely for them to explode on target. My heart pounded away the seconds. It was a rare occasion to get Japanese officers bunched up, and rarer indeed on Peleliu for them to expose themselves. After seemingly endless seconds of suspense, we heard the dull boom as each shell exploded over the ridge and across the valley. Something was wrong, though. I heard one less explosion than the number of shells we had fired. We looked anxiously up at Johnny, who had his eyes glued to the target. Suddenly he spun around, snapped his finger, and stamped his foot. Scowling down at us, he yelled, "Right on target, zeroed in, but the first damned round was a dud. What the hell happened?" We groaned and cursed with frustration. The first shell had gone right through the thatched roof, and the Japanese officers dove for the cave. But the shell didn't explode. Our remaining shells were right on target, too, smashing up and blowing apart the thatched canopy and the table. But the enemy officers were safe inside the cave. Our pinpoint accuracy had been remarkable for a 60mm mortar that normally functioned to neutralize an area with fragments from its bursting shells. Our golden opportunity had vanished because of a dud shell. We set about trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Everybody in the mortar section was cursing and groaning. Suddenly, Snafu accused me of forgetting to pull the safety wire to arm that first shell. I was confident that I had pulled the pin. Some defense worker in an ammunition plant back in the States had made a mistake in the manufacture of the shell, I contended. Snafu wouldn't accept that, and we got into a hot argument. I was angry and frustrated enough myself, We had missed our one chance in a million to avenge the death of our CO. But Snafu was in a rage. It was a matter of pride with him, because he was the gunner and therefore in command of our mortar crew. Snafu was a good Marine and an expert mortarman. His performance of his duties bore absolutely no resemblance to his nickname, Situation Normal, all fouled up. He felt it was a reflection on him that a chance to clobber several Japanese officers had failed because his assistant gunner hadn't pulled the safety wire on a shell. He was proud of a newspaper clipping from his hometown paper in Louisiana describing the effective fire his mortar gun had poured on the Japs during the bloody fighting for Hill 660 on Cape Gloucester. Snafu was a unique character, known and respected by everybody. The guys loved to kid him about his intrepid mortar gun on Hill 660, and he thrived on it. But this foul-up and escape of those enemy officers because of a dud shell was another matter. As we argued, I knew that unless I could prove the dud wasn't my fault, I'd never hear the end of it from Snafu and the other Company K survivors of Peleliu. Fortunately, luck was on my side. We had fired only a couple of shells to register the gun before Johnny called on us to fire on the Japanese. Consequently, I had an accurate count of the number of rounds we had fired from this position. While Snafu ranted and raved, I crawled around on all fours a few feet in front of the gun. With incredible good luck, I found what I was seeking amid the coral gravel and pulverized plant material. I retrieved the safety wire from each shell we had fired. I held them out to Snafu and said, "Okay, count them, and then tell me I didn't pull the wires on all those rounds." He counted them. We knew that no other 60mm mortar had occupied this newly captured position, so all the wires were ours. I was angry the shell had been a dud and the Japanese had escaped, but I was delighted that it wasn't due to my carelessness. I heard no more about the dud. We all wanted to forget it. Word also came that day that the High Command had declared the assault phase of the Palau Islands operation at an end. Many profane and irreverent remarks were made by my buddies to the effect that our leaders were as crazy as hell if they thought that held true on Peleliu. "Somebody from the Division CP needs to come up here and tell them damn nips the assault phase is over," grumbled one man. After dark, the Japanese re-infiltrated some of the positions they had been driven out of around Hill 140. It was the usual hellish night in the ridges, exhausted Marines trying to fight off incredibly aggressive Japanese slipping all around. It was mortar flares, HE shells, grenades, and small arms fire. I was so tired I held one eye open with the fingers of one hand to stay awake, while clutching a grenade or other weapon with the other hand. The next day, 13 October, 3-5 was ordered to renew the offensive and to straighten our lines, forming a salient on Hill 140. Our battalion was the only unit of the 5th Marines still on the lines and ordered to attack. Snipers raised hell all over the place. It seemed to me the fighting would never end as we fired covering fire for our weary riflemen. Our artillery fired heavy support. The next morning, 14 October, Corsairs made a napalm strike against the Japanese on our right. Company I made a probing attack after a mortar barrage was halted by heavy sniper fire. Companies K and L improved their positions and put out more sandbags and concertina wire. The battalion's efforts at attacking seemed like the gasping of a tired steam engine struggling to pull its string of cars up a steep grade. We were barely making it. Rumors flew that Army troops would relieve us the next day, but my cynicism kept me from believing them. We found some Japanese rifles and ammunitions in our area. Hidden under pieces of corrugated iron, I discovered 2 boxes containing about a dozen Japanese grenades. I suggested to an NCO that we take them in case we needed them during the coming night, but he said we could get them later if necessary. We got busy on firing missions with our mortar, and the first time I glanced back toward the boxes, the Souvenir hunters had moved in and were emptying them. Another mortarman and I yelled at the scavenging pests. They left, but all the Japanese grenades were gone. A wave of hope and excitement spread through the ranks that evening when we got solid information that we would be relieved by the Army the next morning. I got less sleep that night than ever. With the end in sight, I didn't want to get my throat slit at the last moment before escaping from the meat grinder. During the morning of 15 October, soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 321st Infantry Regiment, 81st Infantry Division, Wildcats, began moving single file into our area. I couldn't believe it. We were being relieved at last. As the soldiers filed by us into position, a grizzled buddy squatting on his battered helmet eyed them critically and remarked, "Sledgehammer, I don't know about them dog faces. Look how many of 'em wearing glasses, and they look old enough to be my daddy. Besides, them pockets on their dungaree pants sure do look baggy." "They look fine to me. They're our replacements," I answered. "I guess you're right. Thank God they're here," he said reflectively. His observations were correct, though, because most of our fellow Marines hadn't reached the age of 21 yet, and Army dungarees did have large side pockets. "We sure are glad to see you guys," I said to one of the soldiers. He just grinned and said, "Thanks." I knew he wasn't happy to be there. By 15 October, the Marines had compressed the Umerbrogel pocket to an area of about 400 to 500 yards. Yet the soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division faced 6 more weeks of fighting before the process of constant pressure and attrition wiped out the final vestiges of Japanese opposition.
This ends Disc 6.